Masters, but Tuesday's Masters. And we're gonna have a special topic. It's gonna be a person you guys never heard of before, and I hardly mention him ever, Vassily Ivanchuk. So, anyone who has been to my classes, there might be a mild sarcasm involved. Now, this won't be just about Vassily Ivanchuk. Here's some other games in store, but usually, you have the main course and you get the dessert. That's how normal gentlemen and people actually do stuff, but we're gonna mess it all up. We're gonna start with the dessert. We're gonna start with our dessert. And this game is between Ivanchuk and Raczek. Ivanchuk has been on a tear. That's one of the reasons I wanted to show a game of his, a recent game. He actually re-entered top 100. He fell out of it for a little bit, but had two big events that he won back to back. As far as I know, undefeated, which does not surprise me as a regular fan. And let's get into it. So d4, c4, e6, knight c3, d5, bishop g5, d takes c4. Now, Vassily Ivanchuk is very well known to be a scholar of this game. He knows everything about everything. And oftentimes, what they try to do against someone who's so erudite is that they try to surprise someone who knows a lot. Well, is that a mistake?
Gamble.
It is a gamble. And in some sense, it is sort of a mistake. Now, but there's a bit of a backstory for this. Normally, everyone and their grandfather went bishop b4, and then often we see a queen c2 nimzo. But of recent, people started playing d5. This is actually like an older way of playing the Tartakover. If c takes, there's knight takes d5, trying to get a semi-Tarrasch, or e takes d5, which has been all the hype. Bishop g5, c6, and bishop f5. We get into an ending. Black gets a terrible structure with these doubled pawns, but also get a terrible bishop, which is also an upside because that bishop seems somewhat better, but it's sort of a fluke. It looks really, really good on g6, but in reality, it's really out of play. It still does not really exert a ton of pressure, and there's millions and billions of games. Exactly, there is a Kramnik-Carlsen game. There's also a Van Velde short game where black got absolutely clubbered. And oftentimes, they even play f5, which makes this bishop even worse. So this one, even though somewhat popular, it's kind of masochistic. Like if you like to suffer, I recommend you to play this with black. You are going to have a wonderful time. This is indeed an incredibly old line, and you have to have a particular taste to play it with black. Now, one thing is, as noted before, this variation has existed before that suspicious name, Wonderful Time. So e takes bishop g5, and instead Ivanchuk goes for bishop g5, and this is as old as mountains. And bishop g5 is by no means bad, but it kind of gives black the options to switch gears. And here, black does go d takes c4. And now, white goes e4, c5, and knight f3. Now this might seem strange for someone who's uninitiated, but I have to show you why this actually isn't so unreasonable for white. This is what Ivanchuk went for. So if you go d4, there's d5, of course. This is one of the most popular ways of responding, just like e4 to e5. c4, d takes c4, knight f3, or e4, doesn't really matter, c5. Black is trying to undermine the center. Now, of course, the most ambitious move is d5, which is actually not hard to find or kind of deduce because you'd get like a good grip on the center, but black sort of wants to undermine these. I'm not going to get into details, e6, knight c3, knight f6, and the line goes on and on. But even here, white can go say, I'm not willing to get into that very risky and sharp position. I'm just going to go knight f3 here. C takes d4, queen takes d4, takes, and knight takes d4. Remember this position. Snap a picture, print screen if that's what you prefer, or that's closest to you. If you're here, you don't have to do print screen. You can just remember it. Ben Simon already has it. I heard the sound, the clicking sound. Now, we're going to go back to our main game. So, knight f6, bishop g5 takes here, knight f3 takes, queen takes, knight takes d4. And the main topic of the day is exploiting positional mistakes, concessions. Now, in order for us to understand, you really have to know the difference between this position that you have here, this one, compared to the one that we've seen before. What do you think, chat and everyone over here on YouTube, what do you think is the big difference? Because there is a difference between the two positions. Yes, Ben Simon is a computer wizard. That's correct, Gao. So what is the difference that white has compared to the previous one? So whenever you look at positions, you always look for those tiny details. Whenever we talk positional chess, it's about the tiniest bit of details. Now, of course, and that's very much correct, Seabear, white has more freedom. But why can we say that white has more freedom than black does? What makes it ever so clear? And in case you can't quite answer why you have more freedom, you can also answer it by understanding what pieces don't work for black or just misplaced. Black pieces are indeed severely underdeveloped. That's one thing. What else? Any observations here?
This looks really bad for black.
Why? Why does it look bad for black?
Because, well, that knight is under attack, and then the pawn is under attack.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, like, yeah, they are behind in development, and they can't take care of all of it right away.
Yeah, black is behind a lot. Anything else? Because there's something that's super critical to this position and sort of makes a difference, especially compared to the previous one. Now, of course, if we take here, usually black just captures back, so it's not that much of a big deal for black to face that, actually. That's not that big of an issue. Notice that this pawn in the previous example was on e7, not on e6, but on e7. Why is that a big deal?
Well, the light squared bishop can't be developed on that diagonal.
Yep. This bishop on c8 is absolutely mummified and is staring at a wall of pawns on b7 and e6.
Can I ask you an evaluation question?
Yes, definitely. Ask away.
If white were to take on f6 and then black's going to have double pawns on f5.
Takes. I take
But
back.
you said, it's okay, it's not
Uh-huh.
that big of a deal.
Uh-huh.
So when I look at this, I'm like, yeah, I can play b6 for my bishop, and I can develop it to that diagonal and start hitting the e pawn. How do I see that? Like, do you see what I'm getting at? Like, why isn't that a solution to this bad bishop?
To go b6 and bishop b7?
Yeah.
Oh, so I don't think, like, of course, there are solutions, but first it's kind of like diagnosing a sickness.
Okay.
You're just going for a diagnosis. What's the problem here?
Okay.
And then, of course, you can try to find a solution or a medicine for your problems. So I kind of try to separate the two. And oftentimes, I do see that often, that people jump to a conclusion. And they don't want to just have a diagnosis phase. And I think that's very important, because whenever you make a decision, it may turn out to be rash and too quick. And by the way, your b6 idea is not at all wrong. But the question is if that's the most efficient way of playing for black. And to respond to the question of, let's say I take, I'm even just going to show you this, even though I'm not forced to take with the pawn. So doubled pawns, they matter mostly when they're a target. So in the previous example I showed in the ending, that pawn is going to become a nuisance in the long run. This one is not even really doubled. It's sort of in a group with the other pawns. So this e pawn can eventually help out the f pawn. And with the fact that we traded this dark squared bishop, we are lacking this dark squared bishop, and black won't have a lot of trouble defending it. And that's actually the issue. If your opponent gets a bishop pair and you don't get an attack, it's not always necessarily that great to just trade your bishop for the knight. Mostly when it's an ending. If it's a middle game and you weaken your opponent's king, go for it. It's actually a great idea in that case, but of course with the queens off the board, it's not a big deal. So queen takes, knight takes d4. So let's go in the trail that Travis gave us. He said, well, hey, we can try to solve this problem by going b6. And who am I to deny that? It's possible. But if you really want to improve as a player, you sort of want to push yourself. Look for an idea and try to make it even better, if you can. Now, I see in the chat that many people are focusing on, well, white is going to have a fabulous situation after you consolidate the e pawn. That's all true, but that kind of doesn't focus on the main problem of the position. the main thing that you have to solve first is what is black trying to do, or what is black going to do. Now, Natasha, you mentioned that the c pawn is in trouble, right? So with b6, you could get your bishop out here. How can you sort of mix two ideas? How can you save and improve your bishop while saving Private Ryan over here on c4? Although I don't think we're going to get too lucky.
I don't see how that pawn is savable, because I want to play e5.
Uh-huh.
But then once the knight goes back to f3, they need to get the dark squared bishop out to defend e5. So there's no time to play bishop e6.
Yeah. And by the way, even though, like e5, so your e5 idea is amazing in the previous scenario. Because your pawn was on e7, you could move the pawn in one go. In this case, the fact that you would know that there is a scenario where the pawn could make it in one move, you kind of would hesitate to move it again. It's very suspicious here, because you're moving your pawn twice.
If black did play e5 in this position,
Uh-huh.
could you take the knight on f6?
You could.
And then if they then play knight to f5?
You can definitely do that. Or even knight to b5.
Okay. I was thinking
Hit this, get the knight here. This is actually really, really bad for black. But even knight f5 is of interest.
I was only keeping it there because I was like, if they will take there, then I'll get the pawn on f5, and then they're really the f file is really locked down.
Chet is suggesting this move. So right now we've got this, we've got b6. e5 is suspicious because we already know that it just doesn't feel right. So we got this, we got this. But is there an idea where we could improve the bishop, or try to improve the bishop, and also try to aid the other pawn on c4? Because b6, believe it or not, in some sense is a fairly timid move. It's not too ambitious. It accomplishes the job, but it could even do better. Are there any other moves? I suspect there are other moves. But that's my suspicion. a6, and was also played. The whole point being, it's already mentioned in the chat, by the way, a6, you sort of want the same idea of b6, but just like which is typical for the Queen's Gambit accepted, once white takes, black immediately attacks the bishop, kicks the bishop away, and gets the bishop to b7. Now, would it be possible to play it with b6? Yes, but also notice a6 not only is an aggressive move and builds some counterplay, it also takes away this square on b5 from the white knight. So a lot of cases, it's very important you notice the threats of your opponent. Like here, knight b5 is kind of annoying. Bishop d7 is also possible, but this is a bit more ambitious. b5, bishop e2. And bishop e2 again kind of shows that Ivanchuk is very familiar of what's happening here. Goes bishop e2, and doesn't move the bishop to b3 because this is a wall of pawns on e6 and f7, you're not going to be able to break through there. Bishop b7 and pawn to f3. Again, notice white does not trade on f6. Understands that if I trade, I'm giving up an important dark squared bishop. I would be lacking all the critical controls. And after f3, he still controls everything that's important. Knight d7, somewhat of a strange move, but possibly white wants to avoid e5. So knight d7. And now here comes the big question of what should we be doing as white. Now, for all intents and purposes, you could definitely call this an ending, right? There's not going to be a checkmate anytime soon. So therefore, you should be using all the knowledge you gathered about endings. However, of course, there's a little bit of extra spice with all the 4 rooks still on the board. Now, of course, you could play the position in many ways with black. Kind of the main issue will always still remain the bishop starting on c8, now on b7. That's going to be the main issue. It doesn't really matter if you put it on d7 or b7, it's still going to be a problem child. So Gala is saying maybe the question is to castle or not to castle. That is the question. I'm going to go a3 or rook d1. Okay. I like the fact that you're suggesting considering more than a single move. That's very important. Now, I would ask some rhetorical questions, and I will. You're considering rook d1 and pawn to a3. Now, do you consider your position to be inferior or you being in the driver's seat? That is, you're being better.
I like white's position, yeah. I feel it's superior.
So you think white's position is superior. Which move shows more optimism? a3 or rook d1?
Rook d1.
Rook d1 is way more optimistic, right? So, and that's actually maybe, I don't know if it really is, but sometimes you could base your move on vibes. What is the vibe of your position, right? a3 doesn't have this vibe that I'm winning. a3 really has this vibe that I'm defending against something. Now, of course, a3 could a3 be a good move? Sure. But it doesn't really show confidence that white is the one pushing for a win. Okay, so we've got rook d1, we've got a3. I see castles considered. So we've got here, castles considered.
Maybe there's also a possibility to play rook c1, and after a while, like when we castle, to keep d1 square with the other rook.
And you're going to bring this rook to d1. Okay,
Yeah,
that's pretty
like,
nice.
We gotta be careful with the bishop c5.
Uh-huh.
Make sure it doesn't get caught.
Okay, so here, chat is saying, hey, talking about vibes, how about bringing the king to d2? So here's the vibe check for y'all. Vibe check. King d2. King d2, yay, nay? I'm honestly curious about the vibes. Not feeling it? How about you, Natasha? Feeling it?
I'm gonna play rook c1
Okay.
No reason to rush with the king.
Okay. This is not a king of the hill scenario. King f2. Just chess steroid. Okay.
F2 I don't like because of the pin.
F2 you don't like because of the pin.
You know.
Okay.
I kind of like what Natasha was saying. It's like a rook move first, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
then consider something about the king. I like the boldness, though.
You like the boldness of King D2. Yeah, something you can't take away from King D2 is the boldness. It definitely goes with it. Knight B3 is an instinct move. Okay. All right, let's see what Ivanchuk did. He did indeed go Knight B3. The idea being to pester that poor fella on B7, which is sort of going to be a theme. All that said, as you'll see, none of the things that we suggested was completely out of place. It's Knight B3 and Rook C1. Now, of course, he could have tried to play Rook C1 first. One important thing, though, with chess, and I think in this sense it's misunderstood, people are really upset in two cases. If they didn't play the computer move, you shouldn't be upset. In fact, you should be happy that they didn't do that. Second of all, is that the move they suggested wasn't considered or wasn't actually played by the player. And for that, by the way, I always advise to watch videos. And if you haven't yet, you definitely want to see Ivanchuk videos and Ivanchuk interviews, because he will definitely mention ideas that he might not play, but is contingential part of the whole thing, and actually considers it, and he has reasons why he doesn't do so. So Knight B3, trying to go there. So Knight C6, and sort of the knight is a little bit misplaced on C6. Oftentimes, black would want to rather have those knights on C5 and D7, even that everything black does is very, very suspicious. But because in some sense, in some ways, black's position is sketchy. Not overtly sketchy, but in a little bit of a detail, this bishop is sort of entombed still. So Knight B3, Knight C6, Rook C1. And you may notice that he actually does this Rook C1 idea with this same concept of saying, okay, I don't know if I want a castle. I don't know if I want to move my king. I'm pretty sure that this rook will belong on the C file, so I may as well do it right now. And that's actually an incredibly tricky way of playing chess, because that kind of shows that I have a plan, I'm not showing my cards, it's for you to decide what is your plan, and I'm going to react accordingly. Now, of course, you could go to D1, but Rook C1 sort of wants to dissuade black from any C5 stuff. In fact, if Knight C5, there are already some tricks like this. If you check me, I go back. Otherwise, I have the bishop for free. So Rook C1, Bishop E7, Bishop E3. His interviews are so passionate. I love them. Such love for the game. That is correct. So why didn't we trade pieces? Why didn't we trade on E7? Why did Ivanchuk decide to go back?
White has more space.
White has more space. That's correct. We don't want to trade for that reason. Also, black doesn't have space. So in many cases, look at these rooks. They suddenly would connect, And in this case, you're not only trading, but you're also losing a move. You sort of gift black this extra move because they capture back, and with that, connecting them. So Ivanchuk wants none of that and goes bishop e3. Controls this square on c5. Castles and king f2. Close, but still f2. So there is a reason why king d2 isn't really played. You would go king d2 if the rooks were off the board. Let me make this red. Ooh, not blue. Red. Red. Little Riding Hood. It's not a great idea because your opponent might just start hunting your king down. So king f2, and just as Natasha said, the other rook. And this is, again, what comes with positional chess is that you're trying to place your pieces where they both work out perfectly. This rook has a good job on the c file, and this one is going to be perfect on the d file. Rook d8, rook d1, rook c8. Now, technically, we're in the middle game endgame, if that's a thing. Or if not, we just invented a new phrase. So in this middle game endgame, for the uninitiated, nothing is happening. Nothing of value. But we already kind of understood what is wrong with black's position. What is wrong with black's position is that bishop on b7. But by in itself is not going to decide the game. This is the end of the middle game. This is the beginning of the middle game endgame. We're speed running towards an ending, but we're not there yet. So it's one thing to understand and notice that there's a bad bishop there, but we gotta get closer. Gotta get closer somehow. Now, don't forget, we don't have ladies on the board. Therefore, we gotta go slow and steady. This is the middle of problems to find the move. Yes. And this is actually typical in many of these defense positions. Black is behind just a little bit, but there are no clear entry points. Notice that the c5 square is overprotected by black. We can't quite get close to it. And there is also the c4 square, and we can't get near to any of those because of them. Knight b1 is definitely an idea. But knight b1 does feel like you're moving your knight back. So it's to be a position. How else could we try to probe for some weaknesses? So, if you ever played billiards, this is sort of an opener. of a billiards game. You gotta blow it open. Otherwise,
Could you play?
nothing's gonna happen. Yeah?
Could you play F4 here?
F4? Okay. What are you intending to open up?
I'm thinking about eventually going F4, F5, and trying to
Well,
play.
okay, but you don't really, notice that you don't really have enough pieces there.
On the king side, you could say?
On the king side, yeah. Like F4, F5, these guys are a little bit closer to that side than your knights.
I also like it, though, the other reason I liked it was
Mhm.
because it takes away E5.
Mhm.
The knights can't hop
Mhm.
into.
So in general, I don't mind your F4. I have big issues with F5. Why? Because F5, for some reason, that's a very popular idea, but it just gives away way more squares than it doesn't accomplish as much for the squares it gives. You give away too many squares just for attacking a pawn. And it's not even necessarily enough. It has to be the queen side, that's right. Although, I could argue for F4, E5. But again, you played F3 for the reason to solidify your center.
So we're gonna go A4 and try to push the pawn to A5 to separate those two pawns if they push B4.
Exactly, A4. Now, there were some other suggestions. Becky suggested pawn to A3 and knight A2, which is also very interesting. Going A3, knight A2. This would actually be even stronger if the bishops wouldn't be on the board. Like, let's say black goes here, knight A2. The issue here is that black has two defenders, and we just don't have that extra little bit to get that knight to B4. So for that very reason, we can't quite make this work. An interesting idea, and you might actually get knight C5 in, but if you can't get this knight to B4, then the whole thing will not work. And therefore, A4. A4 and B takes. Now if B4, where do you think our knight would go? This again will boil down to the strategic elements of the game. Now go on a little spiel of what do I mean by that. So where to put the pony? And you know what? In some sense, people hate on positional chess because they think it actually doesn't require to have a great fantasy or just a great imagination. But it's actually not true. In fact, if you can imagine this knight on a beautiful spot, then you're already half there. You already kind of know where you should put the knight immediately.
How many moves does it have?
It actually has, well, 4 technically, but you don't want to give up the knight.
Right. So you're limited down to 2.
It really dwindles down to 2 options of these two, of A2 and B1, yes.
It's gonna be B1, otherwise it's entombed.
Mm-hmm. So you go to B1, otherwise it's kind of trapped. But you still kind of didn't answer the big question of, well, okay, just using logic, you don't want to put it on A2. But what's the upside of having it on B1?
D7, C4, D6. D7, D2, like knight D2, C4,
Mm-hmm.
D6.
Yes. And that's also echoing what Chet is saying. The knight will eventually end up on c4. Now, sometimes, I kind of call this somewhat lucky, that having the knight on a2 just doesn't feel right. But you could also solve the problem by saying that, hey, I want my knight on c4 anyways. In fact, let's make it a nicer color. Make it blue. And knight d2, knight c4. And yes, it may seem awfully slow, but notice that white has time. Black can't really do anything. If you move your knight away, then you already, like trying to get aggressive, I already can attack your bishop, and then the a pawn will also fall. And if you do nothing, then I will just go with the slow poke plan of knight d2, knight c4. Anytime black would move any of their other pieces opens up a new square for us. So whatever black does, there's a bit of a concession. And this is, again, typical strategic chess, where you sort of push your opponent slowly off the board. So black, seeing that, decided to take on a4 instead. And of course, we have this huge threat of winning the pawn, which they can't just give away. Takes, knight takes a4, king f8. So with every trade, you get a different formation. And oftentimes, we fall for the trap of just getting stun locked on one position. We kind of fall in love with one position that we looked at instead of treating them as a different position. With that trade, with these two pawns off the board, you again will have to start your search anew and look for a different idea. Now, not a different idea compared to going after the a pawn, but a different idea compared to this pawn push of b4, knight b1. Compared to that, we'll have to find a new plan. Now, in general, does trades favor white? Not really, right? Every trade really favors the defensive side. But there's always sort of a middle ground. Not every trade is created equal. You may know that from colonialism. Same thing in chess. Not every trade is beneficial for both sides. Rook takes d7, case in point, not every trade or sacrifice is good. Rook takes d7, they capture back, and probably black will be really happy. Even if you go knight b6, getting it back, mostly trade everything. It's not such a bad deal. So we've got a suggestion of bishop b6. Any takers for bishop b6 is an idea. Like it, dislike it? What do we think? The knight would take. Well, if you do bishop b6, one of the issues there is that you sort of will be missing that dark squared bishop. We already kind of don't want that, and we avoided that earlier on too. In general, you don't necessarily want to give up your bishop for a knight. So notice, we don't want to give our bishop for the knight. How about we do a reverse? An Uno reverse on our opponent. And if we don't want to give up our bishop for a knight, do you think your opponent wants to give up a bishop for our pony? If only. But I don't think so. So it's a question who should stay and who should go.
It's about c5, right? So you're trying to.
Yeah,
what
knight
you put
c5.
on- Yeah, knight c5.
Yeah, and I mean, not everyone in this chat is a fan of the clash, but if it comes to the question who should stay and who should go, well, this bishop should stay and this bishop should definitely go. So that is not the move. It's knight c5.
So I have
Yeah.
I have the wrong knights.
Hmm?
I picked the other knight. If I'm gonna go knight c5.
No, there's here in this case there's no difference. There is zero difference which knight you
Why
put.
not make it aesthetically beautiful? Get that knight off the red. And
Yeah,
put the red
no,
off.
so, but there are cases, and that's again sort of the upside of strategic chess, is that if you play it well, it doesn't matter which knight you play. In tactical, when you have to checkmate, it matters which knight you play. Here it doesn't matter. You could play this and it's going to be the same result.
What about the aesthetic?
No, I mean, the aesthetic is there, but who am I to, supervise your aesthetics?
I got you.
I have no problems with these aesthetics, but I see the aesthetics with this one too. In any case, black will have to capture because we've got practically a double attack. So takes, knight takes. Again, you have to do something. If you move away, I just take the pawn. If you take here, I take here. So they take. We take with the bishop. Bishop d1. Bishop c6. Bishop d6. Bishop d7. Okay, so we got something. We definitely got something. We got a pair of bishops. And what else is going for us apart from having the bishops? Because there is something that you want to find. Okay, white has the bishops and black has no outpost for the knight. Definitely. These pieces are really terrible. And sometimes we don't even mention the obvious. But
Is the king closer to the center?
our king is definitely closer. Although this king isn't that far. There's something else. And it will matter, as you'll see. As we're sort of ending, and sort of heading, rather, towards the final stretch of the game. Now we're definitely in ending territory. There's nothing middle about this, apart from our king, which we'll get into the middle soon. So, if it's an ending, what is sort of the key feature of all endings that matters most? Well, what is our greatest dream in an ending?
To promote.
The lady. Get a lady. Now, which are the candidates for becoming queens?
The B pawn?
The B pawn and the A pawn. Right? The B and A. Now, which one is a better pawn? And I put quote unquote on there because, it's kind of early to tell. Definitely the B one's better. Why? Because this pawn is more of a target than a potential passer. And that happens because white has the bishops. The bishops have an easier time stopping any threats. Knights, they're really clumsy. So we trade, take, king e3, f4, now we go f4. But here's the big difference.
Very big difference.
The knights are traded, right? And now we're sort of moving forward. Bishop b5, king d4. In a different form of game, we already won. Well, we're not far off, even in chess, to be winning this game. Because again, compare the two kings. This king in the center, much stronger than its counterpart, that's sort of saddened and almost kind of cut off from the king side. And that will actually matter. At b7, bishop b4. And this is again very masterful by Ivanchuk. We are controlling some really important squares over here and cutting off the knight on b7. Bishop c6. Okay, so let's find some critical ideas here, which is kind of crucial. For now, black managed to sort of build a fortress. For example, if I go bishop e2, here, trade, black is just in time to hold it together. Just somehow glue it together. Black has one issue, that the board is too wide. It may not seem like it, but it is. So, how can we emphasize the fact that the board is going to be way too wide for this knight to be useful? How can we expand this board?
She play e5 here.
The G pawn might cry for help.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I can't see it.
That's okay. That's why I'm pointing out that the G pawn is there. Don't just go e5 there.
What about g4?
Uh-huh. So what are we planning to do? It's okay that we move away from those potential threats, but why do we go g4?
f5 and then to take with the g pawn.
Oh, we really want to go f5, I see. You don't have to go f5. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but I think it's a little bit rushed. But definitely g5, f5, it is on the map that you're going to start rolling them. So g4, h4, and now, again, this is the typical idea. Well, black doesn't really have two weaknesses, right? Now, you can actually try to push those pawns off the board, and that's what Ivanchuk does. So g5, king e5, king d6, just moving in, bishop c3, g6. Now, how can we create an issue and get really close to that square on h8? f5, how does f5 help us get to h8? We're really on the road to create another issue for black. Because again, remember, it's all about getting closer to the promotion square. That's right, h5. You're pushing the pawn up to h6. Yes, for now, it's not going to win you the game immediately, but it creates another issue for black. Now, black is stuck there. If black would move and march the king away, well, then I march my king in and pick up the h-pawn and win, because this h-pawn is promoting and it becomes a lady. So black is stuck defending on that square on g8. King f6, and now everyone's dream move, f5. So it's not that Ivanchuk doesn't want the same thing y'all want. He just does it with a little bit more of a preparation. He prepares, gets the pawn to h6, and then he says, okay, now I go f5. Takes, bishop c4. And the big difference is and why he's going to win this ending is that because of that pawn on h6, black is practically down a king. And that's quite a disadvantage, especially in an ending. So bishop e4, again, blocking in the knight. King e5, king d4, moving ever closer. f6, not trading, just closing and shutting down all the play. Bishop b3, king d4, just marking time, but really it's not much you can do. Eventually I am going to come closer. a5 gives up the pawn, but it was already kind of over. Knight c4, b4 defends it, king c5, bishop c6, and I like these moves that Ivanchuk plays. He doesn't rush the pawn push, and that's a mistake that we all do. He prepares these ideas. Bishop e6, bishop f4, bishop c1, just making sure black can't even sacrifice the knight for the pawn. King d4, and the knight is trapped, and also, of course, b5, b6, b7, and the pawn is going to promote. Any questions? As we wrap up this session, I really hope you all enjoyed this lecture on exploiting weaknesses. We're going to come back for next time. We're going to continue with this theme. We got many of more positional exploitation in the future. But for now, I really hope you enjoyed this class. Thank you.